today we're finally back after a few weeks break, and we're going to continue our examination of the Silmarillion, looking through, I guess, chapters 7 to 9. And here with me is, of course, Shrita, and so we'll be discussing the Silmarillion together, going through those chapters and seeing what we can draw out, and hopefully it'll be kind of fruitful. So how are you going, Shrita?
I'm doing all right, just trying to sort of have a better life in 2023 than I did in 2022. But
well, that's good.
Aren't we all?
Well, I hope it works out well. Yeah, we all are, I think. So, yeah. So as I mentioned, we're going to keep going with the Silmarillion today, and look at the three chapters that I mentioned, which are chapters. What did I say? Chapter 7 of the Silmarils, chapter 8, the Darkening of Valinor, and chapter 9, Flight of the Noldor. And I think these three chapters are kind of the culmination of Fëanor's kind of journey, if you like, his character, and sort of brings the first part of the Silmarillion to a close. Because after this, we find ourselves back in Middle-earth, and the story sort of takes on its own momentum from there. So I guess to start, did you have any sort of thoughts overall as it applies to these three chapters? I guess obviously we're going to be talking about the Silmarils themselves, but I guess the character of Fëanor is kind of the one big black hole that sort of sucks everything in these chapters. Quite powerfully drawn. So yeah, I don't know. What did you think reading these?
Yeah, I guess my biggest impression it was that I had the sense that Fëanor was. It's hard to describe, but I had the sense that he as a character is much more complicated than the text lets on to believe. If that makes any sense.
That's interesting. Yeah.
But that's by design, but to be clear that this is not an oversight of Tolkien, but
yeah.
There's some sort of metatextual characterization of Fëanor here that we're supposed to pick up on. That he's sort of a bit more Machiavellian, maybe, than a sort of straight reading would let us to believe.
Indeed.
But I'm not exactly, sure as to whether that's like legit or not. I don't know if
well, I
don't know if like a straight reading would have us sort of be sort of leading in the same direction, or if that's a sort of a bogus reading that's too much sort of in its own head. It was just a feeling that I had. It's perhaps informed by the conversations that we had about the elves in general, especially as the show was sort of happening. We talked a lot about the sort of politics of that, but so maybe that was informing me. But I don't know. I mean, that was one thing that was just sort of straight on my mind. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, no, I think it's not a question of it being legit. I think that, any text like this, or, any other text is going to present to us, or it's going to suggest subtextual readings, if you like. And yeah, I mean, something that I've gone on about, I guess, through interviews and also in the main sort of podcast is this idea that the text, or the Silmarillion in particular, is kind of kind of has a bias in it, and we're going to discuss some of that throughout these chapters, and that is very much sort of an anti-Fëanor bias, as we'll see, and sort of pro-Valar. And, you know, if you wanted to take a really cynical kind of point of view, I guess you could do that and say, well, you know, this is just kind of extolling one side and its values and its point of view over the other. But, you know, in reality, the historical situation was such that neither side was actually more correct or more right than either. So, you know, you could take that sort of reading, as historians often do, of real historical text. And the Silmarillion, as I've sort of emphasized in the past and in interviews again with quite a few scholars, it is kind of a historical text in its own world. So I think it therefore invites that kind of a reading. So I don't think that's illegitimate. And really, perhaps it's with the character of Fëanor where we sort of start to see that really play out, at least at a textual kind of level. So I think that's interesting. All right, so let's start with chapter 7, I guess. So, of the unrest of the Noldor. Of the Silmarillion. I can't even talk. Of the Silmarils and the unrest of the Noldor. I love these chapter titles.
Yeah.
So,
wait, sorry. Before we get into it,
yeah. Sorry, yeah.
Must we have a sort of booze counter here? Like, where are we at here?
Oh.
Seeing as you're already you're tripping over your words, you know, it might be.
I've only had one. I've had one glass of wine, people.
Okay. All right. I'm on number 4, so we'll see where this goes.
Oh, God. Try and say Silmarillion a lot, you know.
Yeah. That's not. I don't envy your position.
You know, a lot of people seem to. Is it the Silmarillion? Yeah, they always have trouble.
Yeah, I'm not about to be reading any of these chapter titles.
Silmarillion. So. Yeah, well, you know, we'll see. So, yes, one thing I want to look out for when we're reading these chapters is sort of a sense of the historical bias in the text, as though we're reading a book of, you know, some sort of account of real history, because I think it actually invites that kind of reading. And I don't see why, you know, that has to be, an illegitimate way to read the book. When I say the text, I feel like I'm a university professor or something. The text, blah, 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 blah. I don't know. It's such a distanced kind of way to refer to a piece of imaginative fiction. But anyway.
No, I think you're right, though. I mean, I've read recently. I can't even remember it now. We may as well go and blame the wine. You know, as opposed to the fact that I'm clearly starting to suffer from craft syndrome. Can't remember a fucking thing. Syndrome.
That's me all the time.
Yeah. The Roman poet who wrote a lot of stuff about you know the you know
yes.
all of these sort of political shit that happened. I can't remember
quite a few of those. Virgil.
No. Here, you know, it may be worth getting the thing. I know where it is. Hang on, give me a minute here.
Well, listeners, Sridhar is going to his bookshelf looking for this Roman poet. Looks like he's found something.
Yes, I've gotten something here. Yeah, by Lucan.
Lucan. Okay, yes.
Yeah. The Pharsalia. I don't know how you actually say it, but you know, the so-called dramatic episodes of the Civil Wars. I've just been reading this, and
wow.
You know, I'm not a classicist. This is not my area of expertise. I have no idea what I'm talking about here, but I can't help but think that someone like Tolkien actually probably did read stuff like this, and he's sort of basing the sort of text style off of this kind of thing. You know, I don't think that it's off base to say that he probably actually meant his text to be interpreted in a sort of historical way. In the way that someone like that Lucan would have, right? Is that crazy? I mean,
No, not at all. I mean, there's from the very start of his sort of creative project, there's the metafictional element, that the idea that the texts are kind of from the world itself, from the world that they are describing, that they are not written, as it were, from a sort of outside perspective, that in some sense they are an interior perspective. So, yeah, I think that's, again, sort of you're invited to think that from the start. I mean, a lot of people, when they read the Silmarillion, and I've said this before, don't approach it that way. They approach it as a kind of, I have a question about the world, the metaphysics of the world. How am I going to answer this? Oh, this is what it says in the Silmarillion. One example of this, for example, is the tendency to want to, for a lot of readers, for example, to want to ascribe certain identifications to Tom Bombadil, the character in Lord of the Rings, who, of course, is cut out or excised of every adaptation, but has that sort of zany quality that doesn't really match onto any of Tolkien's other races. And, he's not an elf. He's obviously not a man. He's not a dwarf. He's not a hobbit, even though he sort of has affinity for hobbit culture because he spends a lot of time amongst them, or at least some time we are lived together. And, he's something else. And so is Goldberry. And then there's Goldberry's, his sort of wife, who seems to be some kind of nature spirit nymph-like figure, but she's never given a sort of place in the hierarchy per se. And a lot of readers, I find, want to do that. They want to say, well, no, we have to assign Tom and Goldberry and Goldberry's mother, for example, who's also seems to be some kind of water spirit. We have to assign them to some kind of category. They have to be one of the Valar or one of the Maya. These sort of angelic or theological sort of categories that we get in the Silmarillion. And something that's always been sort of very, well, I don't know, how would I say it? There's something that to me feels very inadequate about that whole move. So I sort of resist that and want to say, no, hang on. There's obviously, in the Silmarillion and in the Lord of the Rings, there's obviously things that are not known by the characters, right? And perhaps even things by the major characters. There are certain things that are not known. And, what would Gandalf, who is kind of part of this angelic or this order of demigods, for example, what would he say about Tom Bombadil and what sort of creature Tom Bombadil is? Well, we don't know, but, maybe he doesn't know. Maybe he wouldn't have a certain idea about that. So, yes, although we get a kind of theology in the Silmarillion, we get a kind of a story that apparently presents a lot of sort of answers, as it were, to questions. I think it's a mistake to sort of just plug that into the Lord of the Rings or the rest of the text and sort of expect it to all come out looking consistent and coherent. So I think that we're better to read the Silmarillion as a kind of text within the context of the world, as a book within the context of the world, and therefore it's going to have certain interests and biases, or at least a certain point of view. We don't have to read it cynically, as I said before, but I think it's important to sort of read it, at least on some level as a product of that world. So yeah, I don't know what you think of that. But.
Sure. No, that makes perfect sense. Almost as if it were a sort of a work of historiography, within this.
Yeah,
within this context.
I don't even want to use this word, but I'm going to it's a kind of primitive, to in inverted commas, work of historiography, in that it's not even like something like, for example, Thucydides, which in the real world, Thucydides, of course, Greek historian, really tried to get to the bottom of what were the causes of this war. We see in Thucydides, and also, despite his reputation, also Herodotus, we see an attempt to really reason through the causes of war, and really to develop a sense of not just a narrative of events, but also an analytic framework, sort of understanding history. And of course, modern historians ultimately still do that, right? Silmarillion, I feel, is not really like that. It's been called mythology, and yes, it kind of does have that that quality, I guess. So if it's ascribing if it's ascribing sort of characters, if it's ascribing sort of features of character to certain characters, if you want to put it that way, as you mentioned, do we take that at face value, or do we say, well, there's probably some complexity that lies behind this that we're not seeing, or that's being truncated by the author, or that is not being acknowledged? And that's not to say the book is not really dense and complex in itself, but it's one of those books that in its I know what you mean. It's sort of like, it sort of invites contemplation and, again, not a kind of cynical rereading, but a kind of, it invites sort of questions of itself in a way that I think is interesting. Like, yes, okay, so Fëanor is kind of this figure who has certain qualities, blah blah blah, and sort of strides across the sort of mythological view of history that the early Silmarillion has, and then comes to this sort of in chapter 9, which we'll get to, comes to this sort of sudden but sort of very noble, in a sense, heroic, perhaps is a better word, kind of end. How do we, if we're going to read The Lord of the Rings, for example, which is, of course, at least partly inspired by conventions of the novel, which looks at psychology and sort of other things like that, how do we understand that? Do we sort of take it at face value again? Or do we say, well, this is a kind of sketch. It's a mythological sketch akin to the sketch of Achilles in the Iliad. It's not really akin to the sketch that Thucydides gives to, any number of the historical personages in his novel, or not novel, but in his historical text, in his history. So yeah, I don't know, sort of rambling there, but I think, yes. In other words, I think conventions of genre are important to think about. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've sort of lost you sorry, I didn't lose you. I was following you all the way through. It was quite interesting, but I don't remember exactly how that connected to what I was trying to say. But if you want to throw another gambit,
I probably just went off on a tangent. Don't worry.
No. It was quite interesting to hear you to talk about that. I mean, it kind of reminds me of if I may sort of go like on a tangent of a tangent.
Yep.
It kind of reminds me of what it makes me think is that Tolkien is hyper aware of the fact that, like, at least with a certain kind of fiction, like the discourse is really the thing, and he kind of understands it almost to the point that he's written a whole sort of fiction that is essentially discourse. It sounds like enormously pretentious to say, but it does seem like he's sort of aware of the fact that he's sort of aware of the role that commentary plays in history. Again, that sounds, you may as well just sort of gag me and shut me up, but that sounds, it's so pretentious. But yeah, he seems very hip to certain things like that, right? Like the idea of the sort of primal role of the discourse in something, there's a sort of quote unquote discourse and in any kind of narrative. And I don't know, it strikes me as weird as I'm reading it now. I mean, I read the Silmarillion when I was a kid, and it just was, I don't understand how I must have understood it back then. I don't think I did understand it really, but not that I do now, but I think back then I just must have thought, like, oh, here's like some backstory. But now I'm looking at it, and every time I read more of it, I just think, that he had an idea of the sort of the project that he was sort of trying to work on. I don't know how it shifted as his life went on and whether or not he felt that he actually completed it, but it just seems totally different from how most of the people who sort of read him actually sort of portray it, in that way, yeah. But that's a whole different thing. But we should actually talk about the chapters.
No, sure, yeah. No, I think I was just going off your mention of Lucan and sort of agreeing that that it's doing something similar. So I think it's a good comparison. Yeah. But yes, the chapters. So chapter 7, as I mentioned, of the Silmarils and the unrest of the Noldor. Right, it's time for another glass. This is so bad. My God.
Yeah, this is a well lubricated episode, if people can tell already.
Indeed. So we start off in this chapter, of course, with the Silmarils themselves. Important artifacts, obviously. The book is named after these. And so let me quote something. So Fëanor, this character who, if you've read the Silmarillion, you will know is sort of this mythical smith figure almost, but he's an elf. He's he's sort of character within the world. And the author sort of starts off in his description of the Silmarils, or the author, I should say, or the narrator, I guess, by saying that Fëanor was filled with a new thought, or the narrator says it may be that some shadow of foreknowledge came to him of the doom that drew near, and he pondered how the light of the trees, the glory of the blessed realm, might be preserved imperishable. And of course, like the Silmarils themselves, the trees and the light that the trees give off are kind of symbolic in multiple ways, and also metaphorical, I suppose, in multiple ways as well. We might come back to that. And then he creates the Silmarils, these 3 jewels. As 3 great jewels they were in form. And then it says, but not until the end, when Fëanor shall return, who perished ere the sun was made, and sits now in the halls of awaiting, and comes no more among his kin. Not until the sun passes and the moon falls shall it be known of what substance they were made. So immediately, again, we're sort of distanced from the event, right? We're told that Fëanor is in the halls of awaiting, so we sort of know he dies, as it were. And we also don't know what the Silmarils are made of. We're not going to know that till the end of time. So again, there's a bit of convention here that relates back to the genres that we've been talking about, the sort of genre of historical chronologizing, if you like. That sense that all the events that we're reading about here have already taken place. They're just being summarized now. They're being addressed in this book, and that the narrator knows the outcome. So there's no uncertainty on the part of the narrator. So I guess it'd be interesting to start then with the Silmarils themselves. There's so much to say. I don't know where to begin, but so they're designed, first of all, to sort of trap the light of the trees, or at least preserve the light of the trees. And we know that sort of this theme of preserving, of keeping alive, of sort of maintaining the light, literally in this case, but also that can stand in for sort of other features of sort of human culture, or culture itself, I guess, is, comes to the fore in the Silmarils. And I guess when I read the Silmarillion, that's what stands out to me more than the sort of physicality of the objects themselves. But of course, in the story, they do have a kind of physicality and certain features. They're eventually in this chapter hallowed by one of the gods that is sort of made holy, in a sense, that they're given a sort of I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, sort of a radiance beyond that merely of the, like, the physical light that they give off, but they're sort of imbued with a kind of purity, and that gives them, of course, just more mojo, to put it that way. And so, and of course, in the next chapter, chapter 8, the trees are destroyed by Morgoth and Ungoliant. We'll come to Ungoliant. And so, of course, Fëanor's premonition, if you like, it turns out to be true, at least if we believe the narrator. And so all the drama of the next 3 chapters, of course, comes out of this this conflict between the Valar and Fëanor himself, and the creative act of creation. Both have a sort of claim on the Silmarils. The light of the Silmarils is sort of originally, in some sense, the divine light of creation, but Fëanor has created them. They are sort of a unique creation. They cannot be redone. They cannot be created, over again, at least in the same way. So the question then is, what is Fëanor to do? And of course, we all know the answer. He sort of refuses that. He refuses the request to sort of break them up and sort of regenerate the light of the trees. So there's a lot going on here. So I guess, starting with the Silmarils themselves. Again, there's so many sort of ways we could go with this, but what strikes you as the most, I guess, interesting path to look at when we're sort of approaching the Silmarils in this chapter? That sounds like such a high schooly question.
Well, I mean, you should have seen the questions that I was fielding in high school. That makes my high school teachers sound like pedos, but they were not. But so I don't know if this is the most interesting avenue, but one thing that struck me as I was reading this, and quite frankly, like I think in general, as I've been sort of reading more Tolkien, as I've been doing this podcast, is that so there's something quite interesting about the way that let's say like the sort of pre-Abrahamic religions treat their gods, right? So the Hellenistic gods, and really even like the sort of Hindu gods and the sort of classical Hindu mythologies, not so much the sort of modern sort of chauvinist, revisionist versions of them that are so popular. The gods are flawed, right? They're many, and they're flawed, and they're quite human in many ways. And I really appreciated that about the religions and the texts, because I think this is a mythology that actually sort of reflects something of humanity, as opposed to the sort of Abrahamic religion, which I think is largely it misses a lot of that kind of the meatiness that kind of storytelling has with the way the gods act. But the relevant fact here is that what I find quite interesting is that that the Tolkien doesn't merely make the Silmarils an object of metaphysical attraction, right? They're not just beautiful in a sort of spiritual sense. They're literally beautiful, and people like they actually do lust after them. There's like a lustfulness to and this also happens with the ring. I don't know. Is there anything to that? I mean,
yeah, no, absolutely. There is a kind of desirability, in a physical sense, and of course, this is where I think, as the sort of central objects of the text, they're so interesting, because there's a kind of physical attraction to them, as you mentioned. That there's a kind of symbolic, there's a kind of metaphorical dimension, of sort of the creative output more generally of sort of the well, there's perhaps so many layers of metaphor in a sense there. Almost too many to sort of think about. The sort of symbolic of the sort of primal creative impulse, but also the purity of that creative impulse. Not necessarily sort of primal goodness, but just that sheer sort of creative drive. And of course, Fëanor himself is a kind of creator figure, as are many of the characters in this book, starting with the Godhead himself.
Yeah. Just sort of being drawn to something pretty, almost. It's just like, oh, this is, it's perhaps, it is really like lustful. Yeah.
Yeah. Perhaps emblematic just of aesthetic perfection, that their works of art, in addition to sort of being symbolic of something, or in addition to their sort of utility, which is to, in the story, to house this light, right? So yes. No, so yes, in other words, yes, I agree with you. There is, of course, there is, and Morgoth himself, who we haven't mentioned yet, but who, of course, is this kind of Satan figure, as you said, lusts after Silmarils, and does so, well, the text doesn't spell out why, but presumably because, again, they literally house the light which ultimately descends from that sort of original creative impulse, and in each stage along the story, he sort of wants to possess that, and sort of is continually foiled. So, yeah, no, I think there's absolutely sort of legitimacy there. And then so Fëanor creates the Silmarils themselves, 3 of them. And we're given a sort of a beautiful description of them. They house in a fire that is within it, and yet all parts of it. And he really, Fëanor, that is, blends the light of the trees of Valinor, which lives in them yet, though the trees now have long withered and shine no more. So again, there's this authorial sort of knowing. We already know what the narrator at all times knows, sort of what is happening, or what will happen in the context of the story. And then, of course, we've mentioned Morgoth. Morgoth starts to go among the Noldor in Valinor and whispers certain lies to them. The Valar are not really aware of this, but the Noldor, including Fëanor, led by Fëanor, really begin to murmur against them. And many became filled with pride, forgetting how much of what they had and knew came to them as a gift from the Valar. So again, we're sort of getting this kind of, the narrator is always running kind of defense for the Valar in this story, because as we'll see, they sort of make all these bad choices, but the narrator is always kind of say, well, it's really the Noldor's fault, after all. They're sort of they're not grateful enough. And maybe some of that just reflects Tolkien's theology of sort of obedience, in Catholic theology. Well, you got to sort of obey God's will, then everything will turn out all right. And maybe that's true, but I think there's still a tension in the story, regardless of whether Tolkien intended it or not, between the sort of the choices that the Valar make, and also the Noldor, and the sort of the story's perspective on the Noldor, and particularly Fëanor.
Yeah, I agree.
So we get told that Fëanor begins to love the Silmarils with a greedy love and grudge the sight of them to all, so he sort of locks them away. And then the text says something really interesting, which I wanted to comment on. In my edition, page 70, that's the HarperCollins, it says, High princes were Fëanor and Fingolfin, of course, the half-brothers, the elder sons of Finwë, honoured by all in Aman. But now they grew proud and jealous, each of his rights and possessions. And we never hear about this again, but the text here does suggest that both Fëanor and Fingolfin grow jealous of their possessions. This is, as far as I can tell, the only time that Fëanor is ever, that Fingolfin is ever treated as a kind of equal in terms of his moral blightedness to Fëanor. Usually later in the text, he's always the perfect sort of heroic figure. And here we're told that, well, Fingolfin as well is sort of grows jealous of his possessions and rights. And so one wonders here, this is where it comes back to your comment before about the characterization of Fëanor. One wonders here, perhaps the narrator is saying less than he knows, and that Fingolfin as well is also in part to blame for the struggle. Again, if this were Thucydides, we would be given a sort of one assumes, at least it's plausible to assume, let's say, we might be given a much more balanced sort of rendition or balanced profile of both personalities, right? Fëanor was this, but also Fingolfin was kind of vain and, also kind of, self-righteous, and one can sort of imagine that being plausible, right? He wanted to, he was a bit jealous of Fëanor and his father's affections towards Fëanor. And so perhaps there's a hint of that here, but we don't really, it's not really dwelt on. And then it just sort of glides over that and says, Melkor set new lies about. Whispers came to Fëanor that Fingolfin and his sons were plotting to usurp the leadership of Finwë. Of course, this is a kind of a lie, and that the elder line of Fëanor, and to supplant them by the leaf of the Valar. And then, of course, we get Fëanor's confrontation with Fingolfin, which is treated as, Fëanor is kind of this, he's acting on false counsel and the evil whisperings of Melkor. And Fingolfin here is presented as kind of a stoic figure almost. He doesn't react. He's not reactive. And so Fëanor becomes jealous, but Melkor is sort of found out, and then Fëanor is exiled and his father follows him. So there's this great love between his father and Fëanor, which will become important. And so we have this drama developing, and then the Valar have a kind of a showdown with Melkor. He departs in shame, for he was himself in peril and saw not his time yet for revenge. But his heart was black in anger. And then, of course, we get to chapter 8 and the darkening of Valinor. So, we're beginning to see, we see the creation of the Silmarils. We're sort of introduced to the dissension in the family, the half-brothers. Fëanor is mostly blamed, but there's perhaps this little hint that the author is leaving something out. I don't know. When you read that, I don't know if you felt something similar, or you feel that chapter 7 is sort of unjustly biased against Fëanor, as I tend to think. I don't know.
I don't know if unjustly falls into my my lingo, but I'm not as well versed in the thing as you are. So, to me, it seems rather finely versed, but it seems rather finely justified. But I did find myself thinking in general throughout that chapter of the characterization of Virgil, of the sort of rumor. I don't remember if she was characterized as like a monster, but the sort of monster of the rumor in Virgil's Aeneid. Do you remember this? I don't know whose translation this is, so apologies if anyone's sort of Latin it.
I'm sure it's fine, don't worry.
But rumor raced at once through Libya's great cities. Rumor, compared with whom no other is as swift. She flourishes by speed and gains strength as she goes. First limited by fear, she soon reaches into the sky, walks on the ground, and hides her head in the clouds. Earth incites to anger against the gods, so they say. Bore her last a monster, vast and terrible, fleet-winged and swift-foot, sister to, I don't know how you say this, Ceus and Enceladus, who for every feather on her body has as many watchful eyes below, marvelous to tell, as many tongues speaking, as many listening ears. She flies screeching by night through the shadows between earth and sky, never closing her eyelids in sweet sleep. By day she sits on guard on tall rooftops or high towers and scares great cities as tenacious of lies and evil as she is messenger of truth. Now in delight she filled the ears of the nations with endless gossip, singing fact and fiction alike. Aeneas has come, born of Trojan blood, a man whom lovely Dido deigns to unite with. Now they're spending the whole winter together in indulgence, forgetting their royalty, trapped by shameless passion. The vile goddess spread this here and there on men's lips. Immediately she slanted her course towards King Yarvis, and inflamed his mind those words and fueled his anger. Have a drink, ladies and gentlemen. That was a passage from what is that, book 4?
Book 4,
lines
yeah.
173
Yeah.
to 197.
Oh, beautiful. Wow. Yeah, I love that, actually.
Yeah. But whenever I hear of like the whispers, you know, this is what I think of. And whenever I hear of any sort of political machinations that aren't sort of front and center, this is what I think of. And I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, absolutely, that's great. I love all the classical stuff being brought in.
why thank you. But
go on.
This is actually a question that I have. Like, whenever we hear of the sort of like, you know, the whisperings of Melkor, you know, or anything like that, what are we supposed to make of that? Like, what exactly is happening? Are we supposed to have like a clear picture of it? Is there a clear picture that I'm missing? Because this is what I imagine. You know, what I imagine is sort of like a sort of hidden rumor campaign that's not unlike the
description
sort of
in the
rumor monster. In the Aeneid. But I don't know. I mean, am I missing something? Like, what is there anything? Is there any point at which it's sort of clearly stated what is the rumor and the whispering that happens?
My impression is similar to yours. Yeah, that there's a kind of, he's speaking in whispers and spreading dissension, and that that thing gets carried on amongst the population, and therefore, you know, in the end, there's this general anxiety that's sowed, you know, in the way of a rumor or sort of propaganda, if you want a modern sense of it, you know. So I don't think there's any. Yeah, I mean, it is vague in its description, but yeah, I think that's what we're meant to think. That he's sort of that he's cunning in you know, who he talks to and who, you know, who he's trying to influence, and that just says that many lean towards him. You know, he would often walk among them. Amid his fair words, they were woven so subtly that many heard them believed in recollection that they arose from their own thoughts. Visions he would conjure in their hearts of the mighty realms that they could have ruled at their own will in power and freedom in the east, that is in Middle Earth, and then whispers went abroad that the Valar had brought the Eldar to Aman because of their jealousy. So it's unclear here if Melkor is sort of saying, well, the Valar are jealous, or if he's just planting ideas like, well, you know, you could have all these realms, you know, and then the elves themselves are sort of thinking, well, you know, we're only here because the Valar are keeping us here, you know. So he's planting certain ideas, and then they're being extrapolated, and I guess by the hearers themselves. And I guess maybe that there's something there. Again, in the quote you just gave from Virgil, how it sort of grows, the rumor grows and devours. So it is really just
that there isn't really anything concrete to it. It is just
There's not a sort of a campaign of speeches, and you know, I don't think.
The whispering is actually just a thing. Like there's nothing really concrete to the whispering. It's just whispering.
Yeah. It's rumor mongering, and you know, the text, as I said, the text kind of suggests, well, you know, Melkor isn't necessarily planting all the sort of thoughts in people's heads. There are certain ideas, and you put two and two together, and then you sort of think, well, you know, maybe it's like this, sort of a conspiracy, if you like. That's perhaps another analog. Yes, conspiracy theory. Yeah. The Valar are keeping us here. You know, there's kind of conspiracy about this. Again, yes, it's not made sort of. It's not. One has to read between the lines, I suppose, as is the case in the Silmarillion, where much of the narration is distant, to say the least. Dense, but also distant. And as I mentioned, the narrator knows the outcome, so there's always perhaps the narrator is incentivized to try and make events fit together in a way that makes sense. I mean, as historians often perhaps acknowledge, so there's maybe that going on as well.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so it's interesting.
What did you get from that scene or from that chapter?
Well, no, I think I agree. I mean, yeah, Melkor is, as I mentioned, his whispers are just that, the suggestion that he's not necessarily running around giving speeches and sort of denouncing the Valar. He's letting other people come to the conclusions that they will, which happen to...
He's not there making he's not... Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah. It's kind of that deceptive whispers, the sort of Satan trope, if you want to call it a trope.
Yeah.
One can also look at Milton, of course, and we know that in Tolkien's own story, Sauron, of course, will perfect this kind of strategy later on with the elves and the Númenóreans. Although there, especially in Númenor, he might be doing some speechifying, actually. It's a little more political, overtly sort of political.
Sure, yeah.
So there are these, as we've mentioned, there are rumors, there are uncertainties in the elves, there are dissensions in the population. There's dissensions between the brothers Fingolfin and Fëanor. Then, of course, Melkor makes use of this, let's say. He recruits Ungoliant, who is some sort of spirit in the form of a giant spider, and convinces Ungoliant, who lays on a mountaintop, dark Ungoliant lay, and she made a ladder of woven ropes and cast it down, and Melkor climbed upon it and came to that high place, stood beside her, looking out upon the guarded realm. Below them lay the woods of Oromé, and westward shimmered the fields and pastures of Yavanna, gold beneath the tall wheat of the gods. But Melkor looked north and saw afar the shining plain, the silver domes of Valmar, gleaming in the mingling lights of Telperion and Laurelin. Lovely image, but then, of course, what do? They race there and they destroy the trees. So the sort of primal light, which is first instantiated in the lamps, the lamps are destroyed, and then now this primal light is sort of given is given physical form in the trees, and now the trees are about to be destroyed as well. So where does this primal light now reside? Well, the Silmarils. So now Melkor has sowed all this dissension, so we're ready for a kind of explosion of unrest in the Noldor. And of course, we have Fëanor himself, literally the spirit of fire. So things are probably not going to go well, which of course, again, the narrator knows. And then they destroy the trees, and then the unlight of Ungoliant rises up even to the roots of the trees, and Melkor sprang upon the mound, and with his black spear, he smote each tree to its core, wounded them deep, and their sap poured forth, as it were their blood, and was spilled upon the ground. But Ungoliant sucked it up, and going then from the tree to tree, she set her black beak to the wounds, till they were drained, and the poison of death that was in her went into their tissues and withered them root, branch, and leaf, and they died. Quite an image. So, tragedy. And then Melkor escapes.
Well.
Yeah. So what happens next? Well, so we come to chapter 9, the flight of the Noldor, which again I think is the real apotheosis of Fëanor's story, this first act of the Silmarillion. So I guess before we get to that, any thoughts on what's happened so far? So, Fëanor, we have created these Silmarils. Morgoth has sowed dissension and lies. We've talked about that. And now the trees are destroyed. Any thoughts on Ungoliant, this giant spider that sort of comes out of nowhere? And, the destruction of the trees.
Not really. I mean, my sense, it's kind of facetious, but my sense is that this is Tolkien's sort of sense of fantasy, coming through at a time, that the sort of classical Tolkien scholars not necessarily, would not have necessarily put it, at that sense at that time, right? I just had the sense that this is a totally sort of gratuitous, in the best sense of the word, sort of fantasy that's just breaking forth in the text, that some of the more maybe, for lack of a better word, boring critics of Tolkien wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with.
It's
But
not magic realist enough, is it? You know.
Yeah. Yeah. Nor is it quite Catholic enough, but
Maybe not. Yeah.
I don't really know. I don't. I mean, I don't really know what to make of it other than I like that part. It was fun. You know, it was quite fun. And I think, I mean, we kind of talked about this with I think with The Hobbit. You know, it's a shame that he was such a good writer and he was you know, so often so fun to read in a sort of normal sense, right? Not in like a, you know, this is like a, you know, this is like your literary criticism class, or this is your like Catholic theology class, or any sort of, you know, shit like that. You know, he's just like a fun person to read.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is to me sort of in that same realm. Like he's sort of tapping into that same thing. And I don't know, maybe someone who knows more about Tolkien than I do could sort of find some stuff to talk about. But to me, this is just like, oh yeah, like now, you know, it's on, baby. Right?
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, no, I don't want to downplay that at all. Like, it is fun. Like, it's it's a great sort of and the description of the sort of the unlight of Ungoliant. I mean, yeah, on a symbolic level, obviously, there's kind of a you know, Ungoliant represents not only like the antithesis of the light, but also like that somehow the darkness incarnate, or the darkness made physical, you know, in a real substantial ontological kind of way. But yes, but it's fun. Yeah, giant spider, you know. Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic. And then the interaction, the interaction between Morgoth and Ungoliant is kind of funny. You know, he wants, you know, he doesn't want to give her the Silmarils, obviously, because she wants to eat those. You know, will they have all thy world for thy belly? She says, hunger and darker yet, huger and darker yet grew Ungoliant, but her lust was unsated. With one hand thou givest, she said, but with the left hand open thy right hand. In his right hand Morgoth held close the Silmarils. So again, we're seeing the Silmarils as these objects of lust, yes, that were locked in crystal casket. They've begun to burn him. So, you know, he's unworthy of them, you know, of their purity. His hand was clenched in pain, but he would not open it. Nay, he said, thou hast had thy due. For with my power that I put into thee, thy work was accomplished. I need thee no more. These things thou shalt not have nor see. I name them unto myself forever. And then, of course, she tries to take them, but the Balrogs come and save him. So, good on the Balrogs. So, and then she sort of goes away, and she escapes, and the narrator, I'm trying to find the passage, the narrator notes that of the fate of Ungoliant no tale tells, yet some have said that she ended long ago, when in her uttermost famine she devoured herself at last. Sort of a hint perhaps of tragedy there. There's something of the tragic about Ungoliant, the pathetic, but also the grotesque as well. Obviously, as readers of The Lord of the Rings will know from Shelob, of course, who's sort of said to be a spawn of Ungoliant. Something of the Lovecraftian part.
Sure, yeah.
So yes,
I think that's the right term. Yeah.
Morgoth is a kind of rational.
So certainly, it's pathetic.
Yeah. Morgoth is a kind of rational evil. He's the satanic figure, but then occasionally in Tolkien's work, you'll also get that sort of Lovecraftian cosmic horror will sort of creep through. I think you see it in Ungoliant to an extent in Shelob as well, but also in The Lord of the Rings, the sort of these sort of unaccounted for figures. One could even make the claim that Tom Bombadil is he's a kind of positive version of that. He's a kind of
he's like a chaotic.
He's a chaos agent, but
neutral or whatever.
Yeah, chaotic neutral. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's
whatever
a good way to
call him.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I think I remember taking a test one time. I think that's what I ended up being.
Oh yeah.
So I'll take it, but
yeah. Well. Yeah, you look a bit like Tom Bombadil. You need the beard, but yeah.
yeah. Give me a couple more days, I'll.
Yeah, he's got the hair going everywhere, and sort of crazy look in his eyes.
Yeah,
I joke, but but yes, Tom Bombadil. You know, there's not necessarily like threat in Tom Bombadil. He's always like a bit benevolent, but there's. Like, you wouldn't want to cross Tom Bombadil. I don't think he's not going to kill you, but he might do something kind of crazy to you, or I don't know. So yeah, that occasionally that kind of stuff peeks through. And so yeah, finally we get to chapter 9, which is quite a long chapter, and as I mentioned, is really the culmination of Fëanor's story. As the chapter suggests, the Noldor leave Middle-earth. They do so at the behest of Fëanor, who does give a rousing speech, talking about speeches. Of course, this is in the wake of, well, the Silmarils are taken, of course. The Valar say, look, can we open them up? Can we regenerate the trees, But of course, to do this, the Silmarils would have to be destroyed. But they're works of art, they're sort of singular works of art, they can't be replicated. And so Fëanor says no. And then, of course, he finds out that his father has been killed as Morgoth escaped. So Fëanor is in a bit of a mood, let's say. And he's pissed off at the Valar, not only because he now sees them as kind of jailers in a sense, but also because in insisting that he be present to discuss the matter of the Silmarils, he's been absent from his father. So the text sort of mentions, well, even if he'd been there, he would have been slain as well, by Morgoth. He wouldn't have. But even so, I think that's a little bit disingenuous on the part of the narrator. I think that Fëanor perhaps would almost have preferred to have just been slain than to have lost his father. So that's the impression I get anyway. So Fëanor's in a bad mood. And then he moves the Noldor, rouses them, great rhetoric, to rebellion, and they're on their way to Middle-earth. And then, of course, once they try to leave for Middle-earth, they encounter the Teleri. We get the first kinslaying. And, of course, then the burning of the ships, and Fëanor sort of becomes as one Fae, as the text puts it, and seems to hold quite the grudge, quite the resentment to his half-brother, and so denies him passage in the ships. So Fingolfin and his following make this epic journey over the grinding ice at the top of the world sort of thing, in the sort of Arctic regions of Middle-earth, of Arda, into Middle-earth, and then lose a whole lot of people on the way. It's a tragic episode all by itself, and then they come down and they reunite. But there's a lot of dissension, obviously, because Fëanor was a bit of a dick. So, I mean, that's just a bare bones summary. But so this chapter is enormous. A lot is happening. It's very dense. I don't know. What was your? Yeah, I guess again, just I'm interested to hear what you sort of think of this chapter. How do you see Fëanor's character, sort of, to use that horrible word, the sort of arc of Fëanor's character? How is it composed in this chapter? How does it follow on from the kind of somewhat more relatable, or the somewhat at least sympathetic events of the previous chapter? Does he go mad? Is he just practicing a bit of Machiavellian realpolitik, or what's going on?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm curious what you'll think about it.
Yeah, I mean,
my sense was actually that I felt a lot more sympathetic to his character after this chapter than the previous ones. Actually.
Oh, really? So,
yeah,
it's interesting. Even after his actions, sort of burning the ships and all this.
Yeah, I mean, I just got the sense that he was up against. I'm saying it out loud and it sounds just dumb, but I was reading this chapter and I was like, oh, he's really dealing with some shit,
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Fair, fair game.
Yeah, he's sort of in that fog of grief and just total uncertainty, total sort of
in general, as a character, I mean, I don't know that I would actually feel this way with real politicians, because I'd like to think that I have a good sense of being sort of appropriately cynical about our leaders.
Yeah.
I'm not one of these people who's dying to take selfies with the vice president or anything like that, or with the first lady. I'm not one of these people. I think your general position should be one of skepticism.
Yeah.
Against all people who are elected officials.
Yeah.
But with fictional characters, sometimes their crosses, they cross some sort of threshold at a certain point where you're like, oh, now they're just in the shitter, right? Now we're just
yeah.
I kind of feel that this chapter was the one where I was like, all right, fine. I don't know. Is that crazy?
No. I mean, yeah, he's in this miasma of kind of uncertainty and grief, and not only his father, but also the Silmarils themselves, which we're told, are sort of very, very dear, sort of like artworks. And Fëanor, of course, doesn't, on some level, he doesn't order the massacre of the elves in the kinslaying, but it sort of seems to allow it to happen, right? Because he's got a goal and sort of
sure,
ends justify the means, sort of things. And then, but then the burning of the ships is a kind of petty revenge, or for slights that perhaps have not, were not merited, were not given.
No,
yeah, that is a kind of pathetic in the sort of stricter sense. Like he becomes sort of a pathetic character, and his heroism sort of whittles away at that point.
That's exactly it. Yeah,
but we start to see
he becomes a sort of case study in sort of in human weakness.
Yeah.
Or I guess elvish weakness, but I mean, but by this point, he's reduced to something that is human, I guess.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, he's reduced to sort of the baser, impulses. He sort of regains some of that heroism. Of course, he also. I should have mentioned before. Of course, an important point we get in this chapter is, of course, the oath of Fëanor. Fëanor and his son swear an oath, so to take back the Silmarils. So that was an important part of the beginning of the chapter, when the Silmarils are stolen and Fëanor vows to take them back, of course. And so we get a sort of reiteration of that when he dies. Or have I skipped a chapter here? I think I have skipped a chapter, haven't I?
If you have, I've read the chapter. I mean,
no, he does die in this one, doesn't he? Oh no, he dies, I guess, in Sun and Moon. Now I am confused. I can't remember. No, he dies in chapter 13. Yeah, of course. Sorry. Of the Return of the Noldor. I guess it's worth talking about that point, because between chapter 13 and chapter 9, we return to Middle-earth and find out what happens with the Sindar and of course the Sun and the Moon. Let's get that mythological sort of chapter. But yes, I guess the point I was trying to make was he sort of regains his heroic stature to an extent before he dies, but also on the road, or even the aftermath of the kinslaying itself, there is a confrontation with Mandos, perhaps, or perhaps as the text says, a messenger or a herald of Manwë. We get the doom of the Noldor, of course. Tears are numbered, ye shall shed. They're exiled from Valinor, they're shut out, etc. But Fëanor gives a kind of heroic response. And of course, we do still have to, at this point, keep in mind his future actions, his future sort of degeneration. But nonetheless, he has a kind of heroic quality here that he regains when he, in his death as well. He says, "We have sworn, and not lightly, the oath we will keep. We are threatened with many evils and treason, not least. But one thing is not said, that we shall suffer from cowardice, from cravens, or the fear of cravens. Therefore I say, we will go on, and this doom I add, the deeds that we shall do shall be the matter of song until the last days of Arda." It's a very heroic ethos, right? But in that hour, Finarfin forsook the march, his other half-brother. But as I mentioned, Fëanor and Fingolfin continue on. Now, where does he say? Then he destroys the ships. Yeah. So he relinquishes some of that heroism, becomes, as we mentioned, somewhat pathetic. And the story sort of, we're left there as Fingolfin and his host of the Noldor pass over the ice as they've been denied the passage via ship, despite the judgment that the book, the narrator, if you want, lays on him. There's still some sense of Fëanor as a figure of to be revered, right? And he evidently is revered, at least to some extent, in later memory, and the narrator seems to agree with that. So I don't know. Given that there was sort of, what's your diagnosis of Fëanor's character as it's presented here? And in the end, do we have reason for thinking that the text is kind of biased, in favor of his half brothers, or Fingolfin especially,
or in favor of him?
Well, I don't think it's that. I think the narrator clearly is like, he's like heroic, but also like kind of shit. I don't think, I think a Silmarillion written from the point of view of Fëanor's followers would be very different, for example. Or at least it would be,
right.
It would emphasize Fingolfin's culpability in events, which, again, there's kind of intimations of, but not much is said.
Sure. Sorry,
What?
we're,
No, that's
we're getting to the sloppy point of the podcast here.
oh no, we're both a bit tipsy now. No, I was just saying, like, is the text kind of does it give justice to Fëanor, or do you think it judges too harshly given the events that occur or that are said to have occurred?
My sense is that it judges a bit too harshly. That's at least what I felt just sort of on this reading through. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my sense is that that Fëanor is obviously flawed, but he's not flawed in ways that are sort of fundamentally different to other elves or to his kin. I'm not so sure that if we sort of argued about free will, say, in this case, I'm not so sure that I would want to sort of throw him under the bus in the same way. I think given his situation and his sort of priors, I don't think that he acted extraordinarily badly.
Interesting. Yeah,
I think he acted moderately badly, and he got his comeuppance for it.
Yeah.
And one gets what one deserves, but what else is there to do in life? As it were. And there's that. But I don't get the sense that he sort of was necessarily deserving of the sort of throwdown that he sort of earned. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting. I tend to agree that perhaps he's judged a little harshly, although of course he is sort of the major figure of this part of the book. So it's hard to sort of say who else deserves kind of. I mean, Fingolfin doesn't, of course, isn't said to have created a sort of equivalently important artifact such as the Silmarils apparently are. But so, perhaps less blame can be put there. Still, at the same time, there is a kind of minimization of sort of historic forces, I suppose, if you want to put it that way, as often modern historians, for example, will appeal to. And so Fëanor sort of embodies a great man view of history, which may or may not have some validity, and perhaps some historians in the modern period actually tend to minimize personalities where that's important. But certainly one could, I think, make an argument at least that he's sort of treated unfairly, at least to some extent.
There you are.
Pardon me.
So I lost you for a minute there. Yeah.
Oh, right, yeah. So I don't know. I guess that's what I would say about it. Yeah.
Wait, sorry. I think I lost you before you.
Oh,
you maybe thought I did, but I got basically nothing of what you were going to say about.
Oh no,
Fëanor, sorry.
That's no good. I was just saying
if you think the microphone got it, you can give me a condensed summary.
I think it did, but yeah, it's hard to know. I was just saying that there's perhaps less space to blame Fëanor in the text, but considering that he doesn't sort of have an equivalent project, I guess, as the Silmarils themselves, for example. But having said that, perhaps treats him a little more harshly than a modern historian, for example, would if. Oh my god! Now I'm like losing. It treats him a little more harshly than perhaps modern historians would, considering that modern historians tend to minimize the place that individuals play in history, and to perhaps exacerbate the role that historical forces and other conditions play. And maybe that's a mistake of modern history, but if we were to get a Thucydidean view of Fëanor, I think we perhaps would have had a more balanced analysis of the causes and outcomes of the events being depicted. But that's not to say the Silmarillion is like a bad book, because it's like what makes it interesting is that it's a kind of, again, a sort of mythological, a text framed as in part mythology, part legend that is native to the world itself. Yeah, the world itself that it's depicting.
It's like one step removed. It's a
yeah.
I think I don't know. I can't imagine a reading of the Silmarillion as if it were a sort of source material for Middle Earth, which I think some people do read it as, but
in a sense,
I think it's clearly not.
Well, in a sense, it is, but it's source. You've got to, treat it like source material as you would treat like source material in the modern world, like a Lucan, or as you were talking about,
Sure,
some kind of writer.
It's a primary source, but it's not
exactly. Yes,
but it's not. It's not.
Yeah.
I'm struggling to think of an example because again, it's 2 a.m. and we're a bottle of wine in, but it's not. Or at least I am, but it's not. It's not anything that you're. You're citing in your sort of literary criticism class. It's not like the thing that's that's not a good example either, because you are, but you know what I mean. It's not your. This is a disaster. It's just a disaster.
I know what you mean. I mean, it's not. It's not an objective relaying of events.
Here, so for example, if you read Harry Potter, right? The text that you read Harry Potter, like the text that you read when you're reading Harry Potter, that is like, you take that to be like baseline reality, right?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that's not what this is. This is more like a primary source in a reality that exists outside of the text itself.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
and this is not. Yeah.
And I think that's really.
Strongest sentence to get.
You got it there, yeah. No, but I think that's right. I mean, and it really comes through, again, in the sort of the genre, not the convention, but the, and not just the like descriptive minutiae of the text, but in its features. Again, there's a narrator who sort of, is aware of the outcome. We're seeing this from a great remove. We're witnessing this history from a future, right? From a future vantage. And there's, there's a sort of narrative or narrative, what am I trying to say? There's a kind of bias or an agenda that the narrator very clearly, I would say, displays in the text. And, to my, in my reading, that's fairly obvious throughout. There are certain judgments cast on certain characters and less so on others. And, again, that speaks to me of a kind of mythologico-legendary text, more so than it does something, a work of more objective history. But, I think the example of Fëanor is a good one for assessing that argument, as and for assessing the merits of that argument. So, anyway, so I think next time, the next 3 chapters, will deal with Middle Earth and various other matters before we return to Fëanor. But so perhaps next time we'll do chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13, because there's a couple of shorter ones there, so we should be able to get through those pretty quick. So up to the return of the Noldor, and then we'll finish off Fëanor's part of the story, basically, and then we can get on, I guess, to the next part of the story, which is sort of the brief interlude of peace between Fëanor's story and the tales that come after. So is there anything, I guess, final you'd want to say about these chapters, or should we leave it there?
I think we've covered it. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, thanks everyone, and we'll get back to you next month with the next. Well, yeah, we'll do the next 4 chapters, and we'll probably be as drunk as we are now. So please join us then, and make sure to bring your bottle of wine. All right.
There you go. Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much.